Well, you might think that with a name like mine, I'd be something of an expert on Norwich. But you'd be wrong. As a matter of fact, I was 24 before I inherited this title, and I was 22 before my father even chose it. When they made him a lord, he was in a bit of a quandary. He had to choose a name. He himself had been born in London and always lived there, and he didn't really think that Lord London would quite do. And his only other house was just outside Bognor Regis, and Lord Bognor Regis didn't sound quite right either. But there it was, his father and his grandfather and all the family, as far back as it went, had all been merchants of Norwich, and so Norwich was what it was. I've never really felt that I had any right to the title at all. But there it is, I've got it, and I'm jolly proud to bear it. You might also think that to arrive at Norwich this way, from the sea by river, was a pretty eccentric way of getting there. Wrong again. This is the way that people always came to Norwich in the Middle Ages, and indeed right up till about 150 years ago, because Norwich stands at the highest navigable point of the River Yare. You just followed this river up until you ran aground, and then there you were, bang in the middle of the city. Stranger is an important word to the people of Norwich. You hear them say things like, "Oh, he's a perfect stranger. He's only been here 15 years." I'm sure they think the same of me, and I, for one, wouldn't blame them. But stranger is also their word for foreigner, and Norwich has always had close links with abroad, sometimes through invasion, sometimes just through trade. And these invaders and raiders and traders have given the city its rather special place in history. You can see signs of them everywhere. The original Saxons have left some churches with round towers. One of them, at last, now blitzed and, unbelievably, the focal point of a new development. Then came the Normans, who gave it the loveliest of English cathedrals, one that, for my money, knocks spots off Salisbury. And one of the finest castles in the country, though I still can't quite forgive the Victorians for revamping it with all those fancy arches. And then there are the gables. Round ones, curvaceous ones, fluted ones, voluted ones, all of them the legacy of the Dutch and Flemish weavers who settled here from the 14th century onwards. It was those Flemings too, by the way, who were said to have introduced the custom of breeding canaries. Who would have thought, to take just one example, that until 1816, the people of Norwich paid part of their taxes to the king in the form of 24 herring pies a year. You may think it's odd, but to them it isn't really. It's just that the rest of the world does different. To find out a little bit more about that, I landed up in the Jolly Butcher, generally known as Black Anna's, and presided over by Black Anna herself. There I met a prime Norvicentian, I think that's the word, and a real expert on the city, Eric Fowler. How long actually have you been working as a journalist in Norwich or in the area?
Doesn't bear thinking about nearly 50 years.
Nearly 50 years?
Yes, you see, it was just a pleasant place to be.
Perfectly sure it was. And it must have produced some awfully good journalistic stories in its time.
Well, you see, these papers, their great strength was that they were, they never aped, that again, due different. They never aped Fleet Street. They were quite content, indeed proud, to be local. In fact, there was a story, and I checked it in the files and found to my great distress that it wasn't true. But it was said that, the sinking of the Titanic, their heading in the Eastern Daily Press the following morning was Norfolk man drowned. Well, we were talking about this do different business. You want to know what way Norwich and Norfolk do different. Well, as I say, it's partly that we're trendy. We don't like to be always in the fashion. We think if we're about 20 years behind, we're probably all the better for that in some ways. And, of course, we talk a different language. I mean, take this hat. Suppose I was to be clumsy and do that. It's an awful waste. And I say, Alan, And fetch you a dwile and wipe that out for me, will you? You see, that's that word dwile.
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 I don't suppose you ever write it down, but what, D-W-I-L-E?
D-W-I-L-E. And the funny thing is, if you do the same thing, if you spill your beer in Holland, the waiter there will bring what he calls a dwile to wipe it up with. That's Anglo-Saxon. We still talk good old English around here. It's like, what was a Norfolk man's description of a hard winter? You see, first that snow, then that frizz, then that snow, and then that thaw. And then that turned right round and frizz all over again.
Yes, it's lovely.
It got her own grammar. And of course you find that in Chaucer.
So it must have been terribly difficult for people coming up from London to know what people were saying to them.
Some of them find it a little difficult, especially doctors. And of course, you know, we're not always awfully respectful of doctors either. In fact, any established authority sort of nonconformist streak, and some of the stories about our parsons, whom we love dearly, especially when they're sporting parsons. For instance, young girls said to have gone into a village church one day, and he told the old verger, she said, I want the Reverend to christen my little on the Sunday. Oh, he said, no, my dear, so I'm very sorry that he can't. He says, matter of fact, he's saying it mighty use you talking about any day before next Wednesday, 'cause he's going pike fishing Tuesday and he got the farm full of live bait. Quite possibly true.
And that's one of the marvellous things about the people of Norwich, this fierce regional pride of theirs. Unlike most English cities, they don't seem to look up to London. If anything, they think it ought to be the other way round. And all the way through their history, they've always been aggressively independent. It was on this very heath, for example, Mousehold Heath, that Robert Kett rallied his men in 1549 during his Great Rebellion. They had to send government troops up from London, and even then it took them several weeks to crush him. 100 years later, during the Civil War, the people of Norwich were fiercely Cromwellian. Most of them, of course, were also devout Puritans. And that's another very important thing. They've always taken their religion terribly seriously. Puritanism gave rise to nonconformity, and nonconformity, in turn, as it so often does, turned into a sort of political radicalism. So I wasn't at all surprised to learn that Norwich had one of the first Labour MPs in the country. He was elected as early as 1905. From the 1920s on, the city was completely Labour-dominated, and so it's remained virtually without a break until today.
So, all in all, it's not really surprising that the people of Norwich are not too fond of lords, except, of course, for their own Lord Mayor.
You'd never think, would you, looking at this peaceful scene, that in the year 1270, this Lord Mayor's predecessor climbed up the tower of St. George Tombland and, with his merry men, fired crossbows across at the monks of the cathedral here. That particular time, it was the monks who won the round. The Lord Mayor ended up in prison. He didn't stay there very long, and when he came out, all the citizens clubbed together and bought him a new hat. But this was only just one of the chapters in the long and frequently very bitter struggle that was waged over the centuries between the authorities of the city and those of the colossally rich cathedral.
But if, in those days, the two squabbling factions of the cathedral and the mayor controlled the city between them, nowadays there's a third and equally important influence on the fortunes of Norwich: the Norwich Union, one of the largest insurance groups in the country. I asked their chairman, Desmond Long, how it all started.
Well, the original Bignell, Thomas Bignell, lived in Kent, and when he was to come to Norwich, he set up a wine merchant's business in Norwich. He tried to insure his baggage and found that it was impossible to get insurance. And his attitude was, well, if anything should be insurable if people are prepared to pay the premium. Rather applies today, actually.
I have actually got a Norwich Union fire insurance plaque on my own front door that I picked up in an antique shop a few years ago. Which I actually love, the clasped hand sign. We've got one there.
Well, this will entitle you, or would have entitled you in the olden days, to have fire protection from the Norwich Union Fire Brigades, because in the old days the companies ran their own fire engines, and they didn't attend fires unless you carried a fire mark on your property.
But then, tell me, is it true what we've always heard, that when the fire engine trotted up to the burning house, looked on the front door and found that there wasn't the right sort of plaque on it, or possibly that there wasn't a front door to hang the plaque on anymore, is it true that they simply galloped off without making any effort to put out the fire, or do you think that never really happened?
I think probably you'll find some method of paying a first premium when they arrive.
What sort of fire engines did they in fact have in those early days?
Well, of course, they were horse-drawn and local volunteers and run by the companies. But the villages had fire engines of their own, which insurance companies subscribed to. And in fact, there's one in East Anglia, there was one that was a donkey drawn, and Bottom in Cambridgeshire, and they had a photograph of it.
Marvellous, isn't it?
Well, it's a far cry from donkey-drawn fire engines to Norwich Union's vast new complex of buildings. And these epitomise one of Norwich's greatest problems. How do you allow commercial expansion while preserving a medieval city? Places like Elm Hill certainly still look very beautiful and very medieval. So does the superb Strangers' Hall. And back in 1959, Norwich really hit the headlines with its conservation scheme for Magdalen Street. Actually, Magdalen Street looks a bit tatty now, and it has its own flyover, because Norwich, like so many other cities, had to have its inner ring road. And even if its route was specially altered to preserve some of the city wall, the ring road remains with many extremely unpopular, and with nobody more so than with the local historian George Nobbs, who has actually compared its building with the destruction wrought by Genghis Khan.
George, you've written that Rosemary Lane, if it was given the right treatment, could say more about Norwich than a dozen Elm Hills or 100 cathedral closes.
Yes, because Elm Hill and Cathedral Close aren't really part of the real Norwich, working Norwich. And I see here you've got everything that Norwich has got in abundance. There's churches, there's the Saxon Tower here. Next to it, a very attractive shoe factory. The whole area here is dependent, or was dependent on the shoe trade. And there's a couple of chapels here. There's the Zola Strict and Particular Baptists, and then there's the ordinary Baptists over there. That was the chapel where Sir George White, the great father of the shoe trade, used to go. Very great philanthropist and teetotaler and civic leader. And he was so philanthropic that one time he paid his workers to go on strike because they couldn't afford to do it themselves. The union didn't have any money, you see.
Taking philanthropy almost too far.
Yeah.
But why do you have two Baptist chapels quite so close?
I tried to find that out yesterday, actually, but the vicar of this parish told me that these people are so strict and so particular that nobody ever have been able to get in to find out why they'd separated. But over there, there's again something very nice. That used to be the Rosemary Tavern. That's why the Rosemary Lane's got its name.
Of course, it's typical of the mixed character of Norwich that cheek by jowl with beautiful medieval houses like the Rosemary Tavern are council houses, though they're very often quite attractive ones. The council does in fact own a surprisingly high percentage of the city's housing, over 50% of it. But it's not only the council that are restoring old houses, and I bet somebody's going to make a bomb on these newly restored houses with their splendidly elaborate gables and their lovely churchyard setting. Incidentally, the decorations on this church are very typical of Norfolk, and they go, goodness knows why, by the tongue-twisting name of flint flush panelling. I rather like it. But many of my favourite things in Norwich actually have to be looked for. Tombland, the original Saxon market, is, to my mind, a bit of a non-place, though I should be slaughtered in Norwich for saying so. I have to admit that I really prefer the mass of lanes tucked away behind. Where else would you find a shop that only sells mustard? Again, I suspect that many visitors to Norwich never see the beautiful Poole's Ferry, the 15th century water gate to the cathedral, now partly a private house. and nor, I suppose, would many of them bother to visit St. Giles and admire its shop fronts or its lettering.
But of course, the real market centre of Norwich is here. I've always loved this place, ever since one blisteringly cold night in November, about 15 years ago, I bought from one of those stalls what was unquestionably the best and the thickest and the hottest bowl of pea soup I've ever drunk in my life. And I love its coloured stalls and the striped awnings, and the feeling that it always gives me of being somehow much more Belgian or Flemish than English somehow. It's the sort of place you'd expect to find in Ghent or Bruges. Just another example of this old hands across the North Sea thing. Now there are terrible stories and rumours that they're going to clean it up and pasteurize it and sterilize it and homogenize it and wrap it in polythene and untouch it by hand. I hope to God they're not true. If they are, then the decision, that ultimate fateful decision, is going to be taken up there in the new City Hall. When I say new, it's built just before the Second World War, but it still gives a feeling of newness. And many people think it was a disaster when it was built. I wish I knew. I don't know what I think. I used to think it was the most hideous building in England. Now I'm suddenly rather coming round to it, with its sort of vague Scandinavian inspiration, with its two rather twee little chinoiserie cupolas at the corner, and a couple of absolutely splendid heraldic, rather Assyrian lions in the middle. As for what goes on inside it, well, I think it's unlikely, at least, that there's going to be a repetition of the terrible scandal of the turn of the century, when a proposal to demolish that glorious 15th century Guildhall was defeated by the single casting vote of the Lord Mayor. No, I think on the whole we can probably say that the city authorities of Norwich today are just about as conscious of the importance of their medieval heritage as any council in England, probably more so. They're beginning to realize now that this magnificent medieval city has got a character which is, it's not its weakness, but its strength. It's something to be treasured and maintained and preserved and cherished. And look down there now. The phraseology may have changed a bit, but basically the people are doing exactly the same as they've always done for heaven knows how many centuries. Buying and selling under the shadow of their castle on the mound. And they're doing it for the best of all possible reasons, because it makes sense.